This is the story of a woman who broke scientific barriers and did the impossible. Nobody could understand her vision until she helped them all see the future. Today's story is called The Woman in the Eye of the Storm.
Season 1 of The Story features 12 women trailblazers who changed the world. The story is brought to you exclusively by Salesforce, who strives to create workplaces where everyone feels empowered to bring their full, authentic selves to work. And now, onto the story.
He was trying to stop himself from falling asleep. A voice in the distance kept repeating the same thing. Please, try to relax. His mind sifted through the fog. Where am I, he wondered. Relax, you're falling asleep, said the doctor. It's okay if you want to rest a moment. He sank back into the bed, and it all came rushing back to him. He was at a hospital in Los Angeles. His mind revolted. It wasn't a dream. He was at the hospital because he had consented to a new experimental surgery. The procedure and the machine that performed it had never been tested on a real patient. And on top of it, his doctor was extremely young. He was frightened. The doctor kept reassuring him everything would be okay. Relax, she said. The anesthesia is working. You'll be asleep in a moment. He prayed that she knew what she was doing. Patty looked down at the man who was now completely unconscious. It was the most nervous that she'd been in her entire life. The promise she swore to do no harm echoed in her mind. Countless years of research had led to this moment. Now, it was time to begin the surgery. The nurse had both of the man's eyelids held back. Patty thanked her, examined her machine, and went to work. 40 years ago, Patty was just a young girl trying to figure out how to survive in the world. She grew up in Harlem, where she had to battle sexism, poverty, and racism. At first, school was difficult. Most of her teachers disregarded or didn't notice her talents. Or maybe it was because Patty didn't look how they thought gifted people should look. But eventually, through her hard work, all of her teachers were forced to admit the truth. That truth was Patty was gifted. Moreover, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and art all delighted the young girl. Soon a family member took notice and gave her a microscope set as a gift. Now, Patty was armed with a real technological tool. Her superpowers grew. She would use the microscope for hours at a time. Everything went underneath it. Lint, clothes, dust, liquids, you name it. She studied all of it. Soon, school became easy, and she received her high school diploma in just 2.5 years. Before she left high school, she applied for a National Science Foundation scholarship. She won the scholarship and a grant by proposing that stress and nutrition played a serious role in the cause and cure of cancer. Now, I don't know about you, but back in high school, most of us are fighting hangovers or learning how to drive. Meanwhile, Patty was already at odds with the medical establishment. It wasn't until very recently that most doctors would begrudgingly admit that nutrition and stress could contribute to or alleviate disease. Her research was immediately noticed by professors in college. She would go on to complete her BA in chemistry. At that time, Black women were rarely accepted into medical schools, and even if she could gain acceptance, her family couldn't afford it. But Patty applied, got accepted, and figured out how to pay for it. She attended Howard University's medical school, where she received her doctorate in 1968. During those years, the civil rights movement was in full swing. While she was at Howard, President Lyndon B. Johnson delivered a speech where he outlined his plans for civil rights legislation. Chaos swirled around her, and despite it all, Patty managed to stay laser-focused on science. After graduation, she found herself alone. There were no mentors for her. She had to forge her own path. But there's a certain opportunity in this type of alienation, and Patty jumped on it. Yes, she was alone, but she was alone to create. She was alone to imagine possibilities that others couldn't. Now that she was out of medical school, it was time to pick a specialty. She was always interested in medicine, but she wasn't sure what branch she wanted to devote her life to. She thought back to medical school, where she went on a summer trip to Yugoslavia. There, she noticed that racial minorities in the poorer populations didn't receive proper eye care. The higher incidence of blindness in those people was disturbing, to say the least. Patty overcame discrimination and poverty, but these people had it far worse. In that moment, she made a choice. She was going to do the impossible, figure out how to give blind people sight. That was her mission. When she returned to America, she convinced her professors at Columbia Medical School to subsidize eye surgery for certain blind patients. Now, during her residency, she had all the budget she needed for more surgeries. Over the next decade, she would work and struggle tirelessly to learn everything she could about eye surgery. She knew that if she really wanted to solve blindness, she needed to find a niche as a starting point. Her thoughts turned to one of the oldest eye problems, cataracts. Soon, she fell down the rabbit hole and became obsessed. This was the exact starting point she needed to attack the problem. It took a full 5 years of research, countless prototypes, and many tests before her invention was ready for real-world use. It took all of her savings, nights, weekends, but she put it all on the line and built her vision. Back in those days, there wasn't a venture capital industry to place bets on ambitious geniuses. Few people knew how to start a business, let alone invent a new machine, procedure, or technology. Years passed, and her efforts took her all over the world, from Columbia Medical School to Berlin to Washington, D.C., and back to Los Angeles. Now her 40 years of sacrifice and struggle came down to one moment. Patty glanced at her machine and the patient in bed in front of her. She smiled. In another time and place, he could have been one of the men who told her to leave the field. Now, she stood over him and reassured him. The man continued to roll all around as the anesthesia gradually lifted. He continued to ask if he would be okay. Patty carefully removed the gauze around his head and eyes. She knew the man was scared of the new way and the machine she created. He came to her as a last resort. She knew he was still wondering if he should have gone with all the old, traditional doctors. She began speaking to calm him down. The old way of performing this procedure is painful and not very accurate. We have to cut into your eye and manually grind away the cataract. But what I've invented is a more precise and less painful way of doing this procedure. Instead of a manual grinding process, we make a microscopic incision and use a laser to vaporize the cataract, then wash the eye and remove any excess fluid and material all in one fell swoop. We then insert a new lens, letting you see like new again. He wanted to believe her, but he'd been blind for 30 years. His friends and family told him, don't try any new ways. Stick with what had worked before. But something about this surgeon made him take the risk. She was the only person he'd ever met who promised she could restore his sight. This was the moment of truth. Had she made his plight worse? There were already dozens of her colleagues who didn't think women like her should be doctors or surgeons, and especially not surgeons that invested their own money and invented new machines, procedures, and technology. They were always watching her for a single misstep to justify all their prejudices. But Patty didn't misstep. She used that hypercriticism to forge an awe-inspiring attention to detail and an imagination that dwarfed her male counterparts. Carefully, she placed her hands on the patient's head and then finished removing the gauze. The man in front of her was still petrified, holding his eyes tightly shut. Relax, she said. Anxiety will slow the healing process. Stop worrying. Open your eyes. The man tried for a second, paused, and then slowly opened one eye at a time. After 3 decades without sight, he wasn't sure what was happening. He was flooded by colors, light, and objects. He'd forgotten what the world really was like. And now, it was overpowering. Tears came to his eyes, and he blinked a few more times, letting his eyes adjust to the new light and images. Soon, he let his eyes open and marveled at the world around him. His vision wasn't perfect, but it was back. Instinctively, he went to touch his eyes and felt a strong hand stop him. Please don't do that, said Patty. He thanked her, and they smiled. It had worked. She breathed a sigh of relief. The critics who had downplayed her for years now had to face the truth. She had been right. The technology and procedure she invented was giving sight to the blind. Patty was Dr. Patricia Bath. She was one of the first and most successful women pioneers in medicine, technology, entrepreneurship, and telemedicine. She received 4 patents in the United States for her breakthrough device that performed cataract surgery that was virtually painless. Patty's humanitarian heart and pioneering efforts in the field of medicine have inspired millions. She began her life and career with no role models yet she led the way and ended up becoming a role model herself. She exemplified passion and determination and has proved that anything is possible. And that includes the impossible, giving sight to the blind. If Patty can do what she did, what other tyrannies of biology, fate, and genetics can we solve and overcome? Today, Patricia Bath has received dozens of well-deserved honors and awards from multiple colleges and medical groups. At 75 years old, she continues to direct the American Institute for the Prevention of Blindness, an organization that she co-founded. Patty's story is a powerful reminder that with hard work, faith, imagination, and science, anything is possible. If you don't have role models, or if you can't see a path forward, don't let it stop you. If you see a problem or suffering in the world, you can learn the skills to create the technology that solves these problems. The journey won't be easy, but there's no greater legacy than to live a life and make creations that reduce suffering for others. Patty's story is proof that giving sight to the blind isn't a pipe dream. We don't have to live in a world where blindness is the norm. We can create a world where blindness is just one more challenge that human trailblazers solve. If you are seeking to create new things, Patty has some words of wisdom that ring true. Do not allow your mind to be imprisoned by majority thinking. Remember that the limits of science are not the limits of your imagination. That's her story. What's yours going to be?
Thank you for listening to The Story. As a thank you, we have an exclusive giveaway for listeners of The Story, a chance to win one of 10 free tickets to Dreamforce, courtesy of our presenting sponsor, Salesforce. Salesforce is committed to supporting trailblazers like you. If you don't know Dreamforce, you are in for a treat. Dreamforce brings together thought leaders, industry pioneers, and customers for 4 high-energy days of learning, inspiration, equality, fun, and incredible concerts. You can head to thestorypodcast.com and enter to win today. That is thestorypodcast.com. Thank you again to our presenting sponsor, Salesforce, for helping promote equal opportunity and sharing these stories of trailblazers.
If you like this episode of The Story, please help spread these stories by telling one friend. Also, you can hit the subscribe button on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. The Story is created by our team here at The Mission. The Mission is your #1 source for accelerated learning. To get more stories and podcasts like this and our world-class newsletter, subscribe at themission.co. That's themission.co. See you next time.